Hello and welcome. Today we're looking at a pretty fascinating question. Where do the images we have of other people in our minds actually come from? To explore this, we're going to look at a book that turns a very common understanding of discrimination completely on its head. So, when we think about discrimination, what usually comes to mind is something like, one person has a negative opinion of another, perhaps because of prejudice. It's something that happens between individuals. But what if that's only half the story? What if discrimination is far more deeply rooted, essentially built into the way our society functions? That's exactly where Bayat comes in. She shows how political decisions and the way the media reports on things can create exclusion. Let's start with politics. To illustrate how this works, she uses a very concrete example, a case study. The example is the German Islam Conference. Imagine that the government at the time wanted to establish an official point of contact to discuss important issues like integration or religious education in schools. But wait, how do you find a single point of contact for such an enormous, diverse group of over 4 million people? And this is exactly where something crucial happens. A political selection process takes place. The state decides who gets a seat at the table and who doesn't. In doing so, it essentially determines whose voice should count as representative of an entire community. This selection process has a pretty powerful effect. It creates the impression that there is one single, unified group out there. Think of it this way: politics needs clear points of contact to negotiate with, and the media needs simple, easy-to-understand stories. To manage this complexity, a kind of simplification takes place. The category of Muslims is created, as if they were all one homogeneous mass. And this is where it gets really interesting, this artificially constructed unity often has little to do with reality. A study cited in the book found, for example, that less than a quarter of Muslims in Germany felt represented by the major organizations that took part in the conference. Now it gets even more interesting, because we're going to look at how the media doesn't just pick up this simplified image, it actually amplifies it. The author spent years analyzing the coverage in major German newspapers. She looked very closely at one question: who actually gets a voice? Who is allowed to speak? The findings are pretty clear. There is a distinct hierarchy. At the top are representatives of the state and a small number of individuals, often those who are openly critical. The Muslim organizations themselves received significantly less space. Above all, the analysis reveals one thing: the media told a story of conflict. On one side were individuals who were portrayed as liberal and modern. On the other side were organizations depicted as conservative. This simple opposition of good versus bad, of us versus them, dominated the entire debate. And that leads to a pretty strong conclusion, which this statement captures perfectly. When one group constantly speaks about another group, it also determines that group's public image. It holds, so to speak, the power of interpretation. So what is the end result of this interplay between politics and media? The outcome is that Islam is primarily perceived in public as a problem. Whenever Islam or Muslims are discussed in public, it almost always revolves around difficulties. The focus is on integration, security, cultural conflict, and demands. And what gets completely left out? Well, the ordinary lives of millions of people, their daily routines, their work, their very personal experiences. All of that remains almost invisible in this public image. Islam becomes a kind of problem to be managed, rather than a lived reality. And that brings us to the central and perhaps most powerful argument of the author. It turns the perspective completely upside down. The core message is this: the way Muslims are represented actually says far less about Muslims themselves. Instead, it says a great deal about mainstream society, namely, how that society defines for itself who belongs and who doesn't, and what rules the game is played by. Put differently, Bayat's work suggests that the real problem doesn't lie with the people being talked about, but rather in the political and media lens through which they are constantly viewed. And that leaves us at the end with a pretty important question. If public images of groups are constructed in this way, how much does that actually shape our own personal perspective? How strongly does it influence what we think we know about the people living in our neighborhood? Today's episode covered a study by Bayat from 2016. Do you have questions or topic suggestions? Feel free to write to us at YouTube at EmpowerMigra.com. EmpowerMigra, understanding begins with listening.